African woman saves drowning child 15 years later. He returns as an Arab executive to reward her. She thought it was just another ordinary day by the river. But when she heard the desperate screams of a child drowning, she didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the water, risking her life to save a boy she'd never met. Soaking wet, shivering and out of breath, she handed him back to his frantic family and walked away without ever asking for thanks. She never imagined that the boy would remember her face. 15 years later, her world is turned upside down when a luxury car stops in front of her modest home. Out steps a man in an elegant suit, handsome, confident, unmistakably powerful. But when he locks eyes with her, he freezes. Tears rise in his eyes, and then he speaks her name. What he says next will change her life forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That's how we continue to bring you more powerful and emotional stories just like this one. The midday sun beat down on the dry red earth, casting long shadows from the baobab trees that lined the riverbank. Amina wiped the sweat from her forehead as she bent over her laundry basin. Her hands moved methodically, scrubbing the fabric against the rough stone, her mind wandering to the pile of cassava she still had to peel when she got home. Life in her village in Ghana was simple, hard but honest. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees. The river was their playground, their escape from the scorching heat. Amina glanced over her shoulder and smiled at the joy in their eyes. It reminded her of her younger brother, whom she had lost to sickness years ago. The pain never truly left, but the sound of children playing always brought her a kind of peace. Suddenly, the laughter turned into screams. At first, she thought it was part of a game, boys splashing too loudly, teasing each other. But then she saw one of the girls pointing frantically toward the water. "Help! He's drowning!" Without thinking, Amina dropped the cloth in her hands and ran toward the river's edge. Her eyes searched the surface frantically until she saw him, a small boy flailing, disappearing beneath the current. Her heart stopped. He was so little, so helpless. She kicked off her sandals and dove in. The river was colder than she expected. The current was stronger too. She fought her way through the murky water, lungs burning as she pushed herself closer to where she'd last seen him. "Hold on," she whispered, mostly to herself. And then, there, his hand broke the surface. Amina reached out, grabbed his arm, and pulled with everything she had. The boy was limp, eyes wide with fear, water streaming from his mouth. She wrapped one arm around his chest and swam back, her legs kicking violently against the current. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned. But she didn't stop. Finally, her feet touched the muddy riverbed. She dragged him out, collapsing onto the shore with him beside her. "Breathe," she whispered. "Come on. Please breathe." She tilted his head back and pressed her ear to his chest. No sound, no movement. "No," she whispered. She began CPR, something she'd only seen done once in a health campaign held by volunteers from the city, pressing his chest, giving him air, pressing again. And then, a cough. Water burst from the boy's mouth. He gasped. He was alive. The crowd of children erupted in cheers and tears. Moments later, a frantic man came running, his expensive white linen shirt soaked with sweat. He knelt beside the boy and held him close, speaking to him in Arabic. Amina took a step back, catching her breath. The man turned to her. "You saved my son," he said in broken English. She nodded, not expecting anything. It was just what anyone would have done. She didn't need praise. She was just relieved the child would live. The man tried to offer her money, a gold bracelet, anything he could take off in his panic and gratitude. But Amina shook her head. "It's enough that he's alive." She picked up her sandals and walked away barefoot, wet and exhausted, but with a strange warmth in her chest. She never asked for his name. She never told him hers. 15 years passed. Amina never spoke of that day again. Life continued. Harvests, struggles, losses. The village remained the same. She got older, wiser, more tired. But sometimes, when she passed the river, she wondered what had become of that boy. She never expected to find out. Because one morning, just as the sun began to rise over the hills, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled into her village. The car was so out of place, it looked like a vision from another world. The children stopped playing. The women stopped talking. Even the wind seemed to pause. The door opened. A tall man in an elegant tailored suit stepped out. His features were strong, refined, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that carried the weight of something deeply personal. He looked around until his gaze landed on her. Amina stood still, her basket of yams balanced on her hip. He walked toward her slowly, like he had waited for this moment his entire life. When he finally reached her, he spoke her name, her real name. Amina. She dropped the basket, and time stopped. Amina's heart pounded in her chest as the man stood before her. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and every inch of him radiated elegance and control. But behind his composed expression, his eyes shimmered with something else. A storm, a memory. A truth. "You know my name?" she asked cautiously, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man took a step closer. "Yes," he said, with a soft accent that had clearly been shaped by years abroad. "I have waited 15 years to say it." Amina's hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. She had no idea who this man was, no clue how he could know her, and yet there was something familiar in the way he looked at her. Not like a stranger, not like a businessman, like someone who owed her everything. The villagers watched silently from a distance. No one dared interrupt, not when a luxury car had just parked in the middle of their dusty path, and certainly not when the richest-looking man they'd ever seen was standing face to face with the woman who, for all her quiet strength, lived a humble life on the edge of the village. "I'm sorry, but Amina's voice cracked. "Have we met?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, but I was a child. You wouldn't recognize me now." He paused, then added, "You pulled me from the river." Her breath caught in her throat. The memory slammed back into her like a crashing wave. The water, the screaming, the boy's lifeless body in her arms. "You," she whispered, eyes widening. "Yes, I'm Tariq," he said, his voice gentler now. "My father brought us here on business when I was just 7. I wandered too far. I fell into the river. I should have died that day, but you saved me." Amina covered her mouth with one hand, stunned. Tariq gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I never forgot your face. I saw it every night for years. I asked my father who you were, but he didn't know. You left before he could even thank you properly. I swore one day I'd find you." She still couldn't believe it. The quiet boy she once dragged from the current was now a man of wealth and power, standing before her with reverence in his voice. You really came all this way just to find me?" "I did," he said, "and not just to say thank you." Amina shook her head slowly, her voice hoarse. "But I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't even think. I know," he interrupted gently. "And that's what makes it even more powerful. You saved my life with nothing to gain. I was a stranger, a boy with no name. But because of you, I had a second chance. Because of you, I'm alive. Everything I've become, I owe it to you." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she looked away, embarrassed. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You lived with so little, and yet you gave me everything." She looked up at him again, this time seeing the boy in his eyes. That same vulnerability, that same innocence, buried under years of wealth, business, and a hardened world. "I've come to offer you something, Amina," he said. She frowned. "What?" Tariq reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. He handed it to her with both hands, respectfully. She opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. As her eyes scanned the words, her lips parted in shock. "You bought land?" "A home," he said. "For you, for your family. Anywhere you want it. Accra, Marrakesh, even Dubai. Your choice. It's already paid in full." Amina felt dizzy. "Why would you do this?" "Because 15 years ago, you didn't ask for anything. But I've carried this debt every day of my life, I needed to find you. And now that I have, I can't just walk away." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter back into the envelope. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Tariq said with a soft smile. "Say you'll let me repay a little of what you gave me." She nodded, slowly, tears still in her eyes. "I'll think about it." He bowed his head slightly in gratitude. But as he turned to look out toward the village, something in his expression shifted, and Amina, watching him closely, felt it too. This wasn't just a thank you. There was something more, something unspoken, and it was only just beginning. The envelope sat untouched on the table inside Amina's modest home, its crisp white edges out of place among the worn clay dishes and frayed curtains. She hadn't spoken a word since returning from the roadside. Her hands had prepared the tea out of habit, but her mind was far away, still trying to make sense of the man who had appeared like a ghost from the past. Tariq sat across from her, his suit jacket removed now, sleeves rolled slightly up his forearms. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man trying to remember where he came from. His eyes scanned the room with quiet reverence, pausing on the photo of Amina's mother, now gone, and the small clay sculpture by the windowsill. "You kept everything," he said softly. "Even the smell of this place. It's the same." Amina smiled faintly. "My home hasn't changed. But you live in a world I can't even imagine." Tariq chuckled under his breath, but there was no amusement in his voice. "It's not as far from yours as you might think." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think money fixes everything, that power erases fear. But there were nights, Amina, so many nights. I couldn't sleep without dreaming of drowning, of feeling my chest tighten, of reaching for someone I couldn't see." Her lips parted slightly. "My parents moved me back to Dubai within a week of the incident. They never spoke of it again. My father threw himself into his empire, and my mother. She grew colder after that. But I remembered. Every detail. Your voice, your arms around me. The way you said, 'Come on, breathe.'" Amina looked down, her throat tight. She had never thought about how that moment had lived on inside the boy. She assumed he'd forgotten, moved on. But now, seeing him like this, wealthy, composed, yet quietly broken, she realized how deeply it had shaped him. "I didn't know you carried it with you," she whispered. He nodded. "It became my drive. I wanted to build something worthy of the second chance you gave me. I started my own firm at 19, traveled the world before I was 25, but it was always there. That day, you." A pause. "And yet," he added, "I never spoke about you to anyone. Not even the therapists my father forced on me. It was like keeping you to myself was the only way to honor what happened. Silence filled the room, thick and strange. Amina finally spoke. And now that you've found me, what do you want, Tariq? He looked into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something that unsettled her. Uncertainty. I thought I wanted to repay you, he said. But now I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to be here. Amina stood and walked to the window. Outside, the village children played like they always had. Life moved on. But inside her home, something irreversible had taken root. You know, she said softly, still facing the window, no one ever thanked me that day, not even myself. I just came home wet, tired and sore, and I never talked about it again. You saved a life, Tariq said behind her. That never goes unnoticed by the universe. She turned to him. Maybe, but what do we do now? He stood walking toward her, stopping just a breath away. Let me stay, just a few days. I want to understand this place, understand you. Amina hesitated. The idea of a billionaire staying in her humble home was absurd. And yet, there was something in his voice, a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with money. All right, she said after a long pause. But I have rules. He smiled. I'm listening. You eat what I eat. You sleep where I sleep. No special treatment. You want to understand me? Then live like me. He nodded, accepting the challenge. That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the village lights flickered like dying stars, Amina watched Tariq spread a thin blanket across the floor beside hers. No five-star suite. No polished marble. Just a mat, a pillow, and the sound of crickets in the dark. For the first time in years, she felt something strange blooming in her chest. A feeling she had no name for, but one she couldn't ignore. And neither could he. Morning arrived with a golden silence. The air was cooler, the kind that kissed the skin and carried with it the scent of wet earth and blooming mango trees. Amina had already been up for hours, grinding maize in the stone mortar outside. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, each movement a melody of survival. But she wasn't alone. Tariq was beside her, sleeves rolled up, kneeling in the dust with his soft leather shoes now kicked aside. He looked out of place, and yet completely grounded. You've never done this before, have you? Amina teased, smirking as she watched him fumble with the pestle. I run a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. But this is harder. Amina laughed, really laughed. The sound caught even her by surprise. The villagers began to notice him differently that day, not as the mysterious man with the expensive car, but as the guest who helped carry water, who greeted elders with respect, and who tried, failing miserably, to wash cassava without splashing mud everywhere. But not everyone was charmed. That afternoon, as Amina and Tariq walked through the narrow market street, a figure stepped into their path. It was Bako, the village merchant, middle-aged, sharp-tongued, and known for watching everyone a little too closely. "Looks like you've made quite the friend," Bako said to Amina, his eyes on Tariq with suspicion. "Where's he from?" "Dubai," she replied calmly. Bako sniffed. "And what's he doing here? Buying land? Buying people?" Tariq remained silent, but Amina's jaw tightened. "He's not here for that," she said. Bako smirked. "People like him don't come to places like this without wanting something." Tariq took a step forward. His voice was calm, but steady. 15 years ago, she saved my life. I'm here because I owe her everything. I want nothing more than to understand the life she gave me back." Bako grunted, unimpressed, and walked away with a shake of his head. Amina sighed as they continued walking. "Don't take it personally. He distrusts anything that shines." "I don't blame him," Tariq said. "In my world, everything shines, but very little is real." They walked in silence for a while until they reached the hill that overlooked the river. The same river that had once tried to take his life. Tariq sat down on a rock and stared at the water for a long time. "You know," he began, "the irony is that I've had everything a man could want. Money, power, respect. And yet, I've always felt like something was missing." Amina sat beside him. "And you think you'll find it here?" He turned to her, his eyes soft. "I don't know, but I feel more myself here than I do in the tallest building in Dubai." A breeze passed between them. The space grew quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something unsaid. That night, back at her home, Amina made groundnut soup. She served him first, as was tradition for a guest, but Tariq refused the honor and insisted they eat at the same time. "I'm not a guest," he said, "not anymore." After dinner, they sat outside beneath the stars. The silence was no longer awkward. It had become familiar. "Can I ask you something?" Tariq said suddenly. "Of course." "If I hadn't come back, would you have remembered me?" Amina didn't answer right away. Her fingers played with the edge of her scarf. "I would have remembered the boy," she said finally. "But maybe not his face. Just the moment, the feeling, the weight of him in my arms, the sound of him breathing again. That I never forgot." Tariq nodded, eyes fixed on the stars. "I think I came back hoping to repay a debt," he said. "But now, being here, I don't think that's enough." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I wasn't supposed to repay anything. Maybe I was supposed to build something new with you. Her heart skipped, and before she could speak, he added softly, "But I don't know if you'd ever let me." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see a boy from the past. She saw a man on the edge of something real, and that terrified her. It rained that night. Not the soft rhythmic rain that lulled people to sleep, but the kind that fell heavy, sudden, like the sky had broken open. Amina stood by the doorway, arms crossed, watching the downpour soak the dry earth. Behind her, Tariq sat near the fire pit, his suit jacket now forgotten, replaced by one of her brother's old tunics. He looked almost local, but something was off. He hadn't spoken much since dinner, not since he said those words. Maybe I was supposed to build something new with you. Amina turned to him. You've gone quiet. He looked up slowly. His eyes held a sadness that unsettled her. There's something I haven't told you. She stepped inside, closing the wooden door behind her. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the clay walls. What is it? She asked. He exhaled deeply. The day you saved me, I wasn't alone. Amina froze. There was another boy, Tariq continued. My cousin. His name was Zayed. We were both playing near the river. I slipped first. He tried to grab my hand, but the current pulled us both in. Amina's stomach twisted. I didn't know, she whispered. No one did, Tariq said. My father. He told everyone it was just me. He didn't want the scandal. Zayed wasn't supposed to be with us. His family was poor, from the outskirts of Abu Dhabi. My father didn't want the shame of it getting out. Amina sat slowly across from him, her heart pounding. Did Zayed survive? Tariq shook his head. No one ever found his body. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. I remember that day, he said. When you pulled me out, I kept screaming his name. But no one listened. Not even my father. I think he wanted me to forget. And did you? He looked her in the eyes. Never. That day didn't just shape my future. It stole part of it. I lived. But I always wondered why I deserved to. Amina's breath trembled. Tariq. I've spent years trying to be enough, to be worthy of surviving when he didn't. I built my company. I donated millions. I created shelters for children in his name, but none of it brought him back. Amina reached across the fire and gently took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him since the day by the river. This time, she wasn't saving him from drowning, but from himself. You can't carry both your life and his, she said. Survivor's guilt is a weight that never lightens unless you let someone carry it with you. He swallowed hard. "You're the only one I ever wanted to tell." She nodded. "Then don't hide any more." The rain outside began to soften, like the sky itself had heard them. After a long pause, Tariq whispered, "Sometimes I wonder if you had pulled Zayed out instead of me. Maybe the world would be better." "Maybe," Amina said softly. "Or maybe Zayed would have spent his life wondering the same thing." Tariq blinked, his jaw tightening. "You think I'm still wondering who I'm supposed to be?" "I think you're becoming who you were meant to be," she said. "But you won't find that man in skyscrapers or bank accounts." He looked at her, eyes glistening. "Where then?" She smiled gently. "Right here. In the people who remember the boy you were. In the land where you were reborn." The fire between them cracked again, and for a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. Then, knock, knock, knock. They turned. Someone was at the door. Amina stood and opened it. A man in a soaked raincoat stood outside, his face partially hidden beneath the hood. In his hand he held a folder sealed with a golden emblem. "I'm looking for Mr. Tariq al-Mansour," the man said in polished English, "from the Dubai Investment Authority." Tariq stood, confused. "That's me." The man handed him the folder. "Your father has passed. You are now the sole heir to Al-Mansour Holdings." The rain roared once more. Tariq stood frozen, envelope in hand, the words echoing through his mind. Amina stepped beside him. And suddenly, the man who came searching for peace now had an empire on his shoulders. Again. Tariq sat in silence for hours. His father was gone, and with that, a storm of unfinished history returned. The empire now belonged to him, but so did the weight. Amina watched from a distance, knowing the call of power could pull him away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "If I stay, I lose everything my family built." Amina met his gaze. "And if you leave?" He didn't answer. But that night, as he packed his bag, he placed the envelope with the land deed on her table and kissed her hand before walking into the dark. Weeks passed. The village moved on, but Amina didn't. The house felt quieter, emptier. She often sat by the river, watching the water flow as if waiting for something. She told no one about what had happened. Love, perhaps, had bloomed too late. But one night, she found a letter under her door. It was from Dubai. "I'm lost without your voice, and this empire means nothing if you're not in it. I'm sending a plane. If you still believe in what we felt, come." Amina stood on the tarmac, unsure. The jet gleamed under the Dubai sun, and Tariq stood waiting beside it, no longer a boy, no longer just a billionaire. She stepped forward slowly. "Are you sure?" she asked. I was only ever sure of you, he replied. When she entered the plain, the door closed behind them. The desert faded below, and with it, the years they had lost. 6 months later, Amina opened the first orphan center in Zayed's name, built in Ghana, funded by Tariq's foundation. She taught, she smiled, and she finally lived without looking back. Beside her, Tariq planted the first tree of many. We were saved for a reason, he said. Yes, she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder, to save others. And as the wind rustled the leaves, their story became a quiet legend of a woman who saved a drowning boy, and of the man who came back, not to repay her, but to never leave again.